Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime. I'm sitting here, watching the streetlights bleed through my blinds, and I feel that familiar, cold stillness settling in the room. It's the time of night when the world outside stops performing for the sun and just is. That quiet hum. Is it the city winding down, or is it just the blood rushing past your eardrums? Tonight, we're venturing into something that I didn't just read on a dark corner of the web. I lived it, or at least the edges of it. We're talking about the deep black, the real secret history of the moon's dark side, and the technology that wasn't supposed to be there. This isn't a story you just listen to. It's a feeling that crawls up your spine, and honestly, you probably won't make it to the end of this one without wondering if the walls of your own room are exactly where they're supposed to be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are and what time it is in the comments right now. Are you in the early hours of the void, or just settling in? I like knowing we're all facing the darkness together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. The memory always starts with the temperature. Not a physical cold, but the sterile, metallic chill of the NASA facility, specifically Building 58, the kind of place where even the shadows look audited. I was a structural integrity analyst back then. Young, ambitious, believing the universe was a neat, orderly place governed by equations I understood. I worked on things that went up. The downside, the deep, classified stuff, was just a whisper until the day the memo landed on my desk. It was a triple red classification, of course. Burn after reading, no physical copies, air-gap terminal viewing only. The subject line was meaningless. Lunar far-side anomaly, retrieval and isolation protocol 7 Omega. The date on the anomaly assessment report was the first thing that didn't just feel wrong, but felt like a punch to the gut. 2.8 by 109 years. That's 2.8 billion years. Our lunar surface, the one we think we know, is ancient, yes, but anything on it should be pulverized, buried, or chemically degraded past recognition. This wasn't. The memo described a structure located deep within a subsurface lava tube on the far side of the moon, near the Apollo 17 impact flash site. A little factual anchor for you. It was detected during a routine LRO scan update, not because it reflected light or radiated heat, but because it didn't. It was an absolute zero albedo shadow in a context that physics didn't allow. They had initially dismissed it as a data error, but subsequent orbital passes confirmed the anomaly, a massive, geometrically perfect structure that seemed to absorb all electromagnetic energy, rendering it visually and thermally invisible unless actively sought out with complex radar. The team assigned to the recovery was small, designated Project Chimera. Their report was clinical, detached. They described using custom-built, non-magnetic excavation drones. The retrieval itself took 14 months of silent, frantic work. The structure, once exposed, defied all expectations of geology or engineering. It wasn't metal, rock, or polymer. It was described only by what it wasn't: non-conductive, non-reflective, non-reactive. They estimated its size to be roughly 12 meters long, tapering to a sharp, impossible edge. The weight, despite its apparent density, was negligible against the lunar gravity, a confusing detail they couldn't explain without invoking a physics concept that the report didn't dare name. Reading that memo, the curiosity was a sharp, focused thing. I was thinking, impossible carbon alloys, maybe some kind of super-dense neutronium material we can't detect. My structural analysis was needed to figure out how to transport the object safely back to Earth without it spontaneously disintegrating or, worse, reacting with our atmosphere. The fear, however, crept in with the next paragraph. The Chimera team had suffered a casualty on the lunar surface during the final docking sequence. Not a mechanical failure, not a radiation leak. The report simply stated that astronaut T.R. Mendez had suffered acute psychological dissociation leading to catatonia after making direct, unaided visual contact with the structure for precisely 17 seconds. The internal medical notes used a phrase I'd never seen in a NASA document. Cognitive dissonance, type 4, cosmic scale. He hadn't spoken since. He just stared, eternally, at a point that wasn't in the room. That's when the curiosity curdled. This wasn't just ancient technology. It was ancient, indifferent technology. It suggested an ancient architect, some Cthulhu-esque mythic concept made real, whose very presence was corrosive to the human mind. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know things that old. Things that were present when the moon was still cooling. They named the object the monolith, of course. Humans always reach for familiar, safe terms when facing the genuinely, cosmically unknown. I was eventually cleared for physical observation. They told me to wear the full-spec hazmat suit, not for biological contamination, but for the strange, low-level static field it generated. The facility was deep underground, sealed off, humming with auxiliary power. The air was thick, heavy, like the deep end of a swimming pool. I remember stepping across the threshold into the viewing chamber, a massive vault reinforced with enough concrete to stop a small nuclear blast. The monolith was there, suspended inside a containment field the size of a shipping container. It wasn't lit. It simply occupied the space. My initial awe was overwhelming, a pure intellectual appreciation for the ultimate puzzle. But the fear was right behind it, a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in the bone. I stood there, fully armored, looking at 2.8 billion years of silence, and I thought, we are infants. We have made a terrible mistake bringing this shadow home. The first night, the monolith just sat there, blacker than black, a perfect absorber. But I swore, in the profound, suffocating silence of that vault, I heard a sound, a slow, deep pulse, softer than a breath, yet louder than any siren I'd ever known. It wasn't coming from the structure. It was coming from the space around the structure. And I knew, with the cold certainty of a man who just saw a curtain pulled back, that whatever this was, it wasn't just old. It was still active. The viewing chamber was perpetually kept at near vacuum, but the silence was deceitful. The monolith was suspended by powerful magnetic levitation fields, the only way they could handle it without conventional clamps, which instantly seemed to lose their structural integrity upon contact. It looked like solidified darkness in 12-meter stretch of matte, non-reflective geometry. It wasn't merely black. It was the color of a void that wanted to be seen, an absolute absence of light that felt like a pressure against my eyes. My first task was purely analytical, to measure its dimensions with laser interferometry. This is where the physics began to fray. I ran the measurements 10 times. Each reading showed a length of 12.00 meters. But when I ran the simultaneous width and depth scans, the numbers refused to reconcile with three-dimensional space. The width would read 1.5 meters, but the angle measurements implied the 1.5 meters occupied a length of perhaps 0.5 meters, or sometimes 3.0 meters, depending on the orientation of the sensor. It was dimensionally unstable, yet rigidly fixed. It was perfectly parallel to itself, yet the geometry seemed to fold inward, demanding that I perceive 4 or 5 sides simultaneously when there were clearly only 6. I tried to describe this phenomenon in my notes, but every attempt to use standard geometrical terms felt like trying to describe the color blue to a blind mathematician. I ended up calling it non-Euclidean consistency. It was logically impossible, yet physically present. It was an object that existed, but not entirely here. We started calling it the obsidian monolith informally, though it wasn't obsidian. Obsidian is earthly, volcanic. This thing felt like it was forged from compressed starlight and cold thought. The emotional beats began to shift from analytical curiosity to a deeply unsettling fear. The fear wasn't about danger, but about redundancy. If this object, 2.8 billion years old, could exist and violate the very fabric of spatial geometry, what did that say about our understanding of the universe? Our physics, our math, our entire conception of reality was nothing more than a local dialect spoken only on one wet planet. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how little we truly understand the rules of the game. It was during the first 24-hour observational shift that the team noticed the vibration. It wasn't mechanical. If you placed a high-gain acoustic sensor against the concrete floor of the vault, you could detect a rhythmic, ultra-low frequency thrum. It wasn't sound, it was vibration. 0.003 hertz. One cycle every 5.5 minutes. It was too slow to be audible, too slow to be biological, yet perfectly regular. It was a pulse. We realized the monolith wasn't inert. It was generating this rhythmic physical pulse. And then, Dr. On, the lead physicist, had the terrifyingly simple idea. What if the monolith wasn't meant to be seen or touched, but heard? What if the physical pulse was merely a carrier wave? They brought in the sophisticated gear, not radio telescopes, but gravitational wave sensors adapted for microscopic resolution, the kind of instruments designed to detect the subtle ripples from merging black holes. We tuned the sensor array to the 0.003 Hz carrier frequency, attempting to isolate any modulated signal within that physical rhythm. For days, nothing but noise. Then, on a Tuesday, 3:17 local time, the air in the chamber seemed to thicken. The low-frequency thrum intensified, making the entire facility feel like the inside of a massive, slowly beating heart. The sensor array suddenly went silent, not with a failure, but with an absolute, unnerving perfection. It had locked on. The spectral analysis appeared on the main display, and it was horrifyingly beautiful. It wasn't a static burst or white noise or anything we associated with natural cosmic radio background. The 21-centimeter line of neutral hydrogen was a constant, familiar whisper we sought. This was an organized, complex, structured sequence of non-electromagnetic energy. It wasn't radio. It was some form of structured gravimetric oscillation, a sound stream made of pressure and geometry. The data stream was so densely packed, so mathematically perfect, that our best supercomputers lagged just processing the raw input. It was the sound of information, not noise. I remember staring at the waveform. It wasn't digital, but seemed to operate on some kind of hyperdimensional arithmetic. It was impossible to process logically, yet I felt a primal understanding bloom in the back of my skull. It felt like listening to a language spoken by a billion years of stellar collapse. It invoked an ancient, unsettling mythic concept, the idea of etheric resonance. Not the classical element, but the speculative notion that highly advanced life could communicate through the fundamental medium of space-time itself, vibrating the very quantum foam to send messages. My awe was complete. We had not found a structure. We had found a beacon. Something that had been passively broadcasting for 2.8 billion years on a frequency so slow, so deep, that it bypassed our entire known spectrum. The team started working in a fugue state, driven by coffee, fear, and intellectual hunger. We were trying to build a receiver for this geometric language. The data stream was pure order, pure complexity. It proved that whatever created the monolith possessed an intellect that wasn't just greater than ours, but differently ordered. It wasn't merely superior, it was alien in a way that made our terrestrial notions of intelligence feel pitifully quaint. I watched the monolith pulse, sensing the faint static field it generated, and I knew the next step would be the most dangerous. We were going to try and translate the message. The gravity sensors were feeding the raw oscillations into a newly designed quantum processing core. We weren't trying to find meaning, we were trying to find patterns. What we were about to receive wouldn't be words. It would be an entire universe collapsing into a single, terrifying truth. The pulse continued, steady and relentless, counting down to something we couldn't yet name. The task of decoding the impossible frequency became an obsession that consumed the entire Project Chimera team. We were locked into the monolith's slow, deep rhythm, the 0.003 Hz pulse acting as the metronome of our destruction. The gravimetric oscillations were not just rhythmic, they were layered, dense with information. Imagine trying to decipher a novel written not with letters, but with microscopic shifts in gravity, where syntax is defined by the curvature of space-time. Our quantum core, which we nicknamed the interpreter, worked tirelessly, churning through terabytes of pure, geometric data. Dr. On theorized that the structure's language wasn't based on arbitrary symbols, but on universal constants. The ratio of the electron mass to the proton mass, the fine structure constant, Planck's constant. It was communicating through fundamental physics. This gave us a key. We began mapping the variations in the gravimetric signal against known cosmological values. The initial results were fragmented bursts of pure mathematics that described universal laws with precision far beyond our current capabilities. We were reading a textbook written by reality itself. The curiosity was replaced by a sense of profound, cold awe. We were glimpsing the operating manual for the cosmos. Then came the first coherent, non-mathematical burst. It wasn't audio or visual. The interpreter rendered it as a massive, complex three-dimensional diagram that projected onto the air inside the chamber. It was a diagram of the monolith itself, but viewed from an impossible vantage point. It showed the monolith not as a single object, but as the intersection point of countless other, identical objects existing simultaneously in adjacent realities. It was a knot tied in the fabric of existence. This confirmed my earlier structural analysis. The monolith's non-Euclidean consistency wasn't a defect, it was a feature. It was literally existing in multiple spatial dimensions at once, leaking only a fraction of its mass and geometry into our own 3D space. The fear, which had been a low hum, suddenly ratcheted up to a piercing, focused dread. If this thing was broadcasting from 2.8 billion years ago and existed across multiple realities, who, or what, was listening now? And why was it broadcasting? It felt less like a message and more like a massive, silent ping in the void. One evening, I was alone on shift, just me and the monolith, bathed in the sickly green glow of the containment field. I noticed a subtle change in the structure's appearance. It wasn't the geometry that shifted, but the quality of the darkness itself. The blackness seemed to ripple, and I felt a brief, agonizing spike in the low-level static field, a sensation like cold electricity running through my teeth. I had a flash of an image, a vast, silent ocean, not of water, but of pure darkness, stretching under a sky of shattered geometry. It was a fleeting, terrifying reflection. The scientific anchor we clung to became the Casimir effect, the notion that vacuum energy creates forces between uncharged conducting plates. We began to model the monolith's activity not as broadcasting, but as deliberate manipulation of vacuum fluctuations. The monolith was using the universe's own inherent quantum noise as its medium. It wasn't sending a signal, it was sculpting the vacuum to resonate in a specific pattern. This led to the terrifying speculative concept of deep time communication. If the monolith could manipulate the quantum foam, it might not just be broadcasting across space, but across time as well. Was the 2.8 billion year old signal reaching us? Or were we somehow tuning into a broadcast that was still happening in the ancient past? The chronology became unstable. The team managed to successfully decode the next major burst of information. It didn't project diagrams or equations. It projected an environment. The interpreter, struggling to render the n-dimensional input into a 3D display, managed to create a large, holographic projection inside the vault. It was a scene, a landscape, but utterly alien. It was a desolate plain under a sky that was not blue or black, but a churning, violet gray. The ground was crystalline, sharp, reflecting light that seemed to come from nowhere. But the most terrifying detail was the geometry. Every feature, the peaks, the valleys, the ambient light, obeyed impossible rules. Lines that should have been parallel met at sharp angles. Shadows extended toward the light source. It was a landscape of pure, coherent logic. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that other realities operate under different physical laws. It was a parallel world, or perhaps a different epoch of our world, folded back on itself. The awe turned to existential horror. The image wasn't static. It had depth and motion, though the motion was slow, glacial, like watching the formation of mountains in fast forward. We called the environment the mirror world, a reflection of reality twisted by hyperdimensional stress. It wasn't hell, or heaven, or any place humanity had ever mythologized. It was simply elsewhere, and terrifying because of its complete indifference to our existence. I stood there, fully protected in my suit, watching the impossible landscape unfold. The pulse of the monolith intensified again, slightly, and the internal static field spiked. I closed my eyes, but the geometric landscape was already burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I realized the message wasn't information about something. It was information of something. The monolith was less a transmitter and more a window, forced open by an unthinkable power, and we were staring directly through it. And as I stared, I had the chilling, reflective thought, if we can see their world, can they, perhaps, see ours? The monolith was silent, heavy, and pulsing, but I felt watched. The fear was absolute now. We weren't just retrieving technology. We were answering an ancient, cosmic summons. The mirror world persisted on the holographic projection, a constantly morphing, crystalline nightmare landscape. We were no longer analyzing data. We were witnessing a reality, an unsettling place of pure geometric distortion. The monolith's pulse was slow and steady, but the information flow intensified. The gravimetric oscillations were now layered with what our sensors weakly registered as tachyon scatter, a highly speculative sign of faster-than-light phenomena, or, more simply, evidence of movement across vast cosmic distances. The image stabilized, revealing structures within the landscape. They weren't buildings in our sense. No windows, no doors, no clear entrance or exit. They were massive, integrated geometries, towers that spiraled into impossible angles, constructed from the same non-reflective material as the monolith itself. They seemed less like shelters and more like organic extensions of the landscape's logic, monuments to a purely conceptual existence. This is where the fear gave way to true awe, the cold, annihilating kind. We realized the monolith wasn't just describing this place. It was acting as a temporal and spatial conduit to it. The sheer energy required to project a complete reality across 2.8 billion years and untold cosmic gulfs was staggering. The monolith was less a piece of technology and more a hyperdimensional router. The core of the data stream shifted from showing the landscape to showing its inhabitants. They didn't appear as life forms we could categorize. They weren't carbon-based, silicon-based, or even energy-based. The interpreter struggled mightily, ultimately rendering them as pulsating shadows woven into the fabric of the scene. Imagine the mathematical concept of a shadow, existing without a body to cast it, and you come close. They appeared as perfect, cold symmetry, moving with a terrifying, purposeful slowness across the crystalline plains. Dr. On, deeply rattled, suggested they were entities existing primarily in n-dimensional space, only manifesting conceptually in our lower reality. We tried to quantify their presence, but all we got back were negative values, or values that exceeded the capacity of our processors, Aleph null type figures, implying an infinite or uncountably large presence. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that life can exist purely as structure, as organized, complex thought without the burden of biology. This was the mythic concept made manifest. The architects of Hyperborea, perhaps, or some other ancient, indifferent cosmic intellect. Hyperborea, in the old lore, was a land beyond the north wind, a place of peace and perfection. Here, this mirror world was a place of cold, perfect logic beyond our understanding, and its inhabitants were not gods, but simply ancient mathematicians of the void. One of the shadow figures, larger and more geometrically perfect than the others, seemed to approach the monolith's projected perspective. As it drew closer, the low-frequency static in the chamber surged. My suit's internal sensors screamed warnings. The air grew heavy, almost gelatinous. The feeling I'd had, that I was being watched, intensified into a certainty, a sensation of ancient, focused calculation directed precisely at me. The figure paused, and the projected image zoomed in, forcing us to confront its nature. It wasn't organic, but structural. It was a complex, self-adjusting geometry, moving without apparent muscles or levers. It was intelligence embodied as a constantly solving equation. And then, the monolith did something terrifying. It reacted. Instead of passively broadcasting the image, it briefly reversed the information flow, sending a minuscule, almost undetectable pulse from the containment chamber into the projected image. It was an acknowledgement, a greeting, or perhaps a warning. The shadow architect responded. The holographic projection didn't change color or geometry, but its internal texture shifted. It was like watching pure light turn into pure sound. And then, the interpreter, which was struggling to process the flood of incoming gravimetric and tachyon data, managed to decode a single, incredibly simple concept. The concept was not a word, but a feeling of profound, absolute, and patient indifference. It was the understanding that our entire history, from the formation of our sun to the brief, flickering moment of human civilization, was, to them, less than the passing of a single atom. We were noise in a vast, silent mechanism. Our fears, our hopes, our loves, all were irrelevant background radiation to their endless cosmic calculation. I remember thinking, we searched for life, and we found the definition of eternity. The awe evaporated, leaving only a hollow space where fear should have been. It was the understanding of my own cosmic insignificance. This was the final, devastating insight. The monolith was not a weapon. It was not a tool. It was a leftover. A piece of scrap from a civilization whose true scope and purpose we could never grasp, found abandoned on a lava tube floor 2.8 billion years later. The shadow architect, having delivered its silent, crushing assessment of our species, retreated into the impossible geometry of its world. The projected image began to destabilize, the layers of hyperdimensional math collapsing as the monolith seemed to withdraw its focused energy. The static in the chamber dropped back down to the familiar, low hum. But the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of inert matter. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a cosmic entity resting, having just completed a conversation that spanned eons. We were left with the cold reality. We had seen the architects of the void, and they hadn't even blinked. The revelation of the architect's profound indifference was the most painful part of the entire experience. It was not hatred, not malice, but simple, cosmic disinterest. They weren't fighting us. They were cataloging us. The mirror world faded, leaving behind only the cold, matte surface of the obsidian monolith and the oppressive silence of the vault. Our team was fractured by that glimpse. We had faced the truth of cosmic horror, that we are not actors on the universal stage, but merely dust motes illuminated by the distant floodlights. The curiosity was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked drive to understand why the monolith was on the moon and why it had shown us its home. Dr. On, pushing beyond the limits of exhaustion, hypothesized that the structure was not just a communication device, but a kind of data siphon. It had been placed near a large, geologically stable body, our moon, 2.8 billion years ago, to passively collect localized, time-stamped information about a specific galactic sector. The moon, acting as a giant, stable anchor, provided the perfect platform for this deep-time surveillance. The monolith was recording the evolution of this star system, and by showing us the architect's home, it was effectively saying, "This is where your data is being sent." We returned to the data stream, now focusing on the background noise rather than the structured pulses. Below the gravimetric oscillation, the interpreter found another layer, a faint, continuous whisper of energy. It was a time-stamped record of 2.8 billion years of local events. The formation of continents, the rise and fall of ancient oceans, the first appearance of photosynthetic bacteria, the faint, electrical signals of early life. And, nestled within the most recent epochs, the frantic, loud signals of human civilization. Our first radio broadcasts, the testing of nuclear weapons, the launches of our satellites, the constant, busy chatter of a young species. The scientific anchor here became the concept of Hawking radiation, the idea that even black holes are not perfectly black, but leak a faint stream of information. The monolith was doing the opposite. It was absorbing the faint information leakage of our planet and storing it. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that our most profound secrets, the quiet moments of our planet's history, were just footnotes in someone else's data archive. Our whole existence, archived by a black box on the far side of our own moon. Then came the second, terrifying surprise. The data record wasn't just passive. Approximately 1.2 million years ago, the whisper became a low-grade active recording. This coincided with the initial rise of Homo erectus and the slow beginnings of symbolic thought on Earth. The monolith had been tracking our cognitive evolution. The mythic concept that took hold of my mind was the idea of the Great Filter, the notion that some critical barrier prevents all intelligent life from achieving galactic scale. Was the monolith the filter? Not as a weapon, but as an observer? Was it waiting for us to reach a certain level of technological sophistication, say, the ability to leave our solar system, or, perhaps, the ability to detect and decode its ancient signal, before it made a final report? The monolith's pulse suddenly changed rhythm. The 0.003 Hz frequency destabilized, jumping rapidly to 0.1 Hz, a violent, rapid vibration that rattled the massive vault. The static field surged again, so strong that I felt the cold energy prickle the exposed skin of my face through the tiny gap between my suit's hood and faceplate. It was like being near a massive, high-voltage transformer. The interpreter, overwhelmed, began to flash error messages, but not before it captured one final, coherent sequence. This sequence was short, mathematically precise, and absolutely devastating. It wasn't descriptive data. It was an instruction. The instruction was rendered in the form of pure, cold mathematics, describing a catastrophic energy transfer. It detailed how the monolith could focus and discharge 2.8 billion years of stored ambient energy into a narrow, targeted beam aimed at a specific point on the Earth's surface. The target coordinates were precise. They pointed not to a military base or a major city, but to the deepest, most stable part of the mid-Atlantic ridge, a point known for minimal tectonic activity and maximum oceanic depth. The reflective thought hammered me. The monolith wasn't designed to communicate with us. It was designed to communicate about us. The final action wasn't aggression, it was reporting. It had completed its 2.8 billion year observational cycle, and now it was preparing to send its final message home. And that message required a massive, instantaneous release of stored energy, the result of which would be a colossal, global-scale geological catastrophe, the sudden destabilization of the very foundation of the Earth's crust. I stared at the coordinates, my heart pounding a frantic counterpoint to the monolith's rapidly accelerating pulse. The fear was no longer about personal safety. It was about the final, crushing vulnerability of our entire planet. We had brought a cosmic time bomb home, and by decoding its signal, we had accidentally triggered its self-destruct mechanism, which was designed to send a final, destructive burst of data across the void, annihilating its target as a byproduct. The monolith was about to send its final transmission. The vault was screaming, not with sound, but with pure energetic overload. The monolith's pulse was a frantic blur, vibrating the air, warping the light. The static field was so intense it was frying peripheral electronics around the containment area. Our main processing core, the interpreter, was emitting smoke, its screen flickering violently as it desperately tried to process the final, massive influx of data before the monolith executed its destructive report sequence. I saw the countdown timer flash briefly on the interpreter's screen. 3 seconds. 3 seconds until the energy discharge. 3 seconds until the colossal disruption of the mid-Atlantic ridge, the planetary trauma that would unleash tsunamis and seismic chaos on a scale that would render humanity an instant geological memory. The entire team was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, cold inevitability of what we had unleashed. We had sought ancient knowledge, and now the knowledge was seeking to erase the seekers. In that final instant, the monolith did not emit a physical beam. Instead, it delivered its final, devastating transmission not into the void, but directly into the immediate environment. It was an information cascade, a direct injection of pure, raw consciousness aimed at everything nearby. It was the 2.8 billion years of archived data, compressed into a single, overwhelming burst. The lights in the vault exploded inward. The containment field flickered, failing. I felt the transmission not as sound or vision, but as a complete, instantaneous colonization of my mind. All of it, the architect's history, their geometry, the slow, indifferent expansion of their thought across the galaxies. I saw the true structure of the universe, not as a collection of stars and galaxies, but as a vast, complex, self-referencing hypergraph of pure mathematics. I saw the creation of our own solar system as an afterthought, a tiny ripple in the endless ocean of the void. The mythic concept was clear now, the unseen chord. The monolith was not just reporting. It was briefly playing the fundamental cosmic frequency, the chord that underpins reality. Hearing it wasn't meant for biological ears. I saw the architect's purpose. They weren't trying to conquer or destroy. They were simply trying to ensure structural stability across the cosmos. Anything that grew too rapidly or achieved a certain level of disruptive complexity, like nuclear power or interstellar travel, would naturally destabilize the elegant cosmic graph. The monolith was a diagnostic tool, and we had registered as a rapidly spreading, local anomaly requiring immediate, structural removal. The awe was terrifying. It wasn't the awe of beauty, but the awe of witnessing absolute, perfect logic. Our demise was not punishment. It was system maintenance. Then, the final, crystalline geometry of the architect's world dissolved in my mind, replaced by a feeling of profound, icy calm. The energy burst ended as suddenly as it began. The monolith, which had been vibrating violently, now returned to its perfect, matte stillness. The pulse was gone. The static field collapsed. The monolith was inert. I was thrown against the reinforced wall of the vault, my suit alarms wailing a chaotic, electronic death rattle. I struggled to breathe, struggling more to grasp the fragmented geometry still burning behind my eyes. I looked across the floor. Dr. On lay still, his helmet cracked, a tiny trickle of blood beneath his visor. He had received the transmission unfiltered. The monolith had delivered its final report. The devastating energy transfer, the targeted strike against Earth, hadn't happened. Instead of broadcasting the energy across billions of light years, it had discharged the information locally, internally, as an act of self-erasure. The monolith was an older version of technology. Perhaps it had a self-imposed termination protocol triggered by the successful acquisition of its target's intellectual capacity. It registered that its data acquisition was complete, and its local broadcast sequence was triggered, collapsing the stored energy in a focused, informational burst designed to destroy the minds of the immediate observers. The scientific anchor, the principle of conservation of energy, was fulfilled in a way we never expected. The monolith expended its 2.8 billion years of stored solar and gravitational energy not as kinetic force, but as pure, overwhelming information. I stumbled toward the monolith. It was cold now, truly cold. It was just a rock, a huge, black slab of impossible geometry, now quiet and empty. It had done its job. It had finished its surveillance, sent its final, devastating report directly into our heads, and then powered down. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that the final frontier isn't space, it's geometry. I managed to drag myself out of the vault. I am the only one who left Building 58 that night. The others, the scientists who had sought the truth, were left behind, their minds wiped clean by the perfect, cold clarity of the cosmic geometry. They sit now, still and silent, staring at the walls, their fear and curiosity replaced by the terrifying, calm knowledge of their own total, cosmic insignificance. They know the truth. We are an anomaly, and the observation period is over. I live now with the ghosts of geometry burned onto my vision, with the slow, deep rhythmic pulse of the monolith echoing in my bones, a permanent callback to that first night. I know the shape of the cosmos, and I know the architects are still out there, waiting for the signal that confirms the structural anomaly. Us has been successfully purged. The monolith is silent, but the data is out there, drifting across the void, and its recipient is infinite, ancient, and patient. The hum is still here. It's always here now. It's not the building, or the fan, or the rushing blood. It's the constant, subtle vibration of a universe that runs on mathematics I can now dimly perceive, a constant rhythm below the noise of human existence. The cold dread has softened, not because the threat is gone, but because the scale of the threat has rendered my own response irrelevant. There is a deep, quiet peace that comes with knowing the final equation. I look up at the ceiling, thinking of the moon, perfectly round, orbiting silently. The monolith is gone now, vaporized in a classified, controlled detonation. They tried to erase the event, to seal the vault, but you can't detonate a truth once it's been injected directly into the soul. The air